everybody. There we go. Okay, so this lecture is about rhetorical analysis, and it's going to give you some practice with working on rhetorical analysis, specifically with Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. So bear with me because my kids and family are home. Also, I have a dog snoring in the kitchen, so you might hear her. Sorry about that if so. But I'm doing my best. We're surviving in lockdown. Okay. So spoiler alert, if you haven't read through A Modest Proposal yet, I would definitely not go ahead with this conference until you have finished reading it. It's very important that you read it on your own first so that you get the full effect of what Swift does with language and what exactly his proposal is. So if you haven't read it, go ahead and take a step back, go and read through it. If it doesn't make sense or you're confused, that's okay. That's kind of supposed to happen. And then go back and work through this PowerPoint and maybe, look it up online, look at Spark Notes and that kind of thing. Okay, so if you have read it, then continue on. Okay, so with any rhetorical analysis that we're doing, you have some specific goals for our class and for generally just rhetorical analysis. So some of those goals, the first thing that you want to do is make sure that you identify the author's purpose. So you should be asking yourself sort of, what do you think the author wants me to do, think, or feel as a result of reading this piece, or maybe of hearing a speech or something like that? So in this case, we're looking at a written piece, a written work that would have been handed out as a pamphlet in Ireland in the 1700s. So we're going to have to consider all of that when we're looking at the author's purpose, which we'll get to in a moment. You also need to identify the rhetorical situation, and these two sort of work together because the author's purpose is often influenced by the rhetorical situation. So the rhetorical situation just refers to what was happening in the world at the time when a piece was written. So in this case, we have to remember that Jonathan Swift's rhetorical situation is much different than, our current rhetorical situation, right? He's in a very different place and a different time and has different things going on that he's responding to. So we'll have to do some research to figure out what the rhetorical situation is. When you're doing rhetorical analysis, you also need to identify what kinds of rhetoric the author uses. So as we read through a piece, we're going to kind of keep our eyes out for different types of rhetoric that the author uses. So that can be any of those rhetorical features that we discussed in the Intro to Rhetoric lecture. So things like pathos, ethos, and logos, definitely. But also things like form or repetition, word choice, all of those things can come up. And once you've done all of that sort of prep work of doing the research to identify the rhetorical situation, figuring out what you think the author's purpose is, and then also finding out what type of rhetoric you see, then you're ready to choose some quotes and discuss those examples of rhetoric being used. And then you need to also be, trying to and working on discussing how and why that rhetoric is effective at persuading the audience. So remember that the author has a certain purpose, and they're using those rhetorical features to try and persuade us to, believe them or to accomplish whatever that purpose is. So all of this is going to be working together. So remember that when we're looking at literature at all, there's never one right answer because everybody comes to literature with different ideas, different backgrounds, and different exposure to different topics, right? So when we're analyzing literature in any way, there's never one right answer that is like the right one, right? It's not like math where there's only one right way to do it. With literature, it's open-ended, so there can be several different purposes. some of the purposes that I identify when I read Swift's A Modest Proposal are these things that I've listed here. So I think that one of his goals was to shock his readers. He wants us to be surprised and maybe disgusted when we finally get to what his proposal is. He also wants to sort of trick us into reading his entire proposal because he doesn't reveal what he wants us to do about the population problem until well into the proposal. So by that point, we've been reading for several pages and we think, yeah, this sounds pretty good. You know, he sounds like he's done his research. He sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And then well into the piece, he hits us with, by the way, my proposal is that we should cook and eat babies, right? So he wants to trick us into reading that because if he opened up his first paragraph with, hey guys, there's a population problem and my solution is that we should eat all the children, there's no way that we would continue reading on, right? So he sort of waits and lures us into this false sense of security before he then hits us with this shocking proposal. And he does that on purpose, right? But ultimately, his goal, I think, is to convince us that something better than, eating these children needs to be done about this situation. And so that's his goal and his reason for presenting this shocking, so-called proposal and for tricking us into reading it all the way through. So in case you didn't catch that, because I didn't the first time I read A Modest Proposal, he is being sarcastic, right? He's using satire. He doesn't actually want us to eat babies, but he wants us to go along with him for long enough that we think that his proposal makes sense and it sounds great until he reveals what that proposal is. And then we're shocked and disgusted and upset. And because we're feeling all of those things, then we're realizing that, hey, we really need to come up with a better solution. Okay, so one of the first things that it's important to do when you're trying to identify the author's purpose is to also look at what was going on in the world when this author wrote this piece. So in this case, I've given you guys a background sort of article about some things that were going on at that place and time when A Modest Proposal was written. So in my own research, some things that stuck out to me about the rhetorical situation were these things here. So we definitely had widespread famine and poverty in Ireland. People were starving. They were very poor. It wasn't a time when we had things like unemployment or any sort of social assistance to help people out. It was really a matter of if your farm, failed that year, or if somebody got injured and couldn't do their job, or if somebody just couldn't get hired for whatever reason, then your family would literally be starving or homeless or, in the streets. So it was a very different time and place in terms of what was available to people, because we have to remember this was the 1700s. There weren't a lot of, even shelters and things like that. There wasn't a lot of built-in support. So we had widespread famine and poverty that were going on at the time. We also had this situation where wealthy landowners were profiting from the people who worked their land, but they really didn't care about if those people were, healthy and taken care of. They more just looked at them as like a source of income for them, right? So they had people living there that would work their land, and then they would take the crops and try and, make a profit off of them or export those goods and do whatever they needed to do with them. And they really didn't care about those workers. So that's what people were dealing with on a daily basis. And as Swift sees it, the Irish are also allowing this to happen as well. So he doesn't think that they're completely blameless. He blames the people who are putting them in this position, like the wealthy landowners, but he also blames the Irish citizens themselves for, allowing this to happen, for not revolting and sort of demanding some sort of change on their own. Then we also had some complicated political and religious things that were happening. And you can get more information about that in the article that I gave you that's background for this particular piece. So it was a really complicated situation that was happening in Ireland at the time. And Swift is responding to all of this, right? So if you look through his proposal, you'll see him mentioning things that refer to politics, mentioning things that refer to different religious, unrest that was happening. You also see him, sorry, my voice is kind of coming and going today. You'll also see him sort of blaming the Irish here and there, as well as the wealthy landowners, the English. And you definitely see him address things like famine and poverty. So all of these things are things that he's responding to, and things that led him to feel like writing a modest proposal was so important and something that he needed to do to get people's attention and to make them sort of wake up and care about what was going on. So the next thing that you need to do, once you've figured out what you think the author's purpose is, and also what the rhetorical situation is, so you've got that background information, then you also need to start looking for examples of rhetoric. So remember that rhetoric is just the language that the author uses to persuade, to accomplish his or her goal. And one of the ways that we go about finding those examples of rhetoric so that we can talk about them is through annotation, and then also through active reading. So if you haven't heard of annotating before, it just means that you're sort of highlighting key passages. You might be writing questions or comments in the margins if you have a printed copy, or you could write those notes on a separate piece of paper if you're reading online. Sorry. And I would also like for you to get in the habit of looking up unfamiliar words as you read, especially with this text, because it's from the 1700s. There are a lot of weird words in here. And so it's totally fine and very helpful to look those things up so that you know what's going on and what those words mean. We also want to practice active reading. So that means that you're sort of questioning and commenting as you read. You can find ways in which you agree, disagree, or otherwise respond to the text. This is really helpful with rhetorical analysis because you are a part of the audience as well, right? When you're reading a modest proposal and you get to the part where he says, by the way, let's eat babies, you're probably going to go, what? And be, disgusted or upset or shocked. And it's important to make a note of that because that will help you to see this is how the rhetoric affects the reader. When he says this, it makes me shocked, right? Also, remember to identify your purpose as a reader. So the things that you annotate and the way that you read are going to shift based on what you need to get out of that reading. So for this case, we're looking at a modest proposal and we need to find rhetoric. We need to find places where Swift is revealing his purpose or revealing things about the rhetorical situation. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to be looking for. I've given you some examples of annotation here. There are a million different ways to do this, and I'm perfectly happy with whichever form of annotation you like to use. So you can use an annotation guide like this one here. If you just look that up online, you'll find plenty of different annotation guides, and you can use one that's already pre-made like this. You can also make your own. So for example, when I annotate, I still use stars for important ideas. I use an exclamation point when there's something that I find really interesting, maybe shocking or I want to come back to. I use a question mark when I'm like, I'm not sure what this means, or I have a question about that. So I use some of these, but not all of them. I've also had lots of luck using different colors. So maybe I'll have, blue for questions, green for something that I agree with, red or pink for something that I disagree with, and you can do it that way. All of the things that I read often look like this with tons of writing in the margins. And that just helps me to sort of keep track of what I thought at the time when I read it, or I might have a question or, something that I need to look up. So any of these would work for annotating, but get in the habit of marking up your text as you read. Okay, so as I'm annotating, I apologize, I hope I didn't just cough in your ear. So as I'm annotating, I like to use tables because that's just a way that, organizing things works for me, but you can certainly do this in whatever way works for you. So what I do is I make a table with all of the stuff that I know I need to get out of that assignment or that reading. So for instance, for this reading, I'm asking you guys to look at different types of rhetoric and then to talk about why it works, right? And to use evidence from the text to help you do that. So I would have a table like this in my notes, and I would have one column for a type of rhetoric. Then I would have another column for a quote that is an example of that type of rhetoric. And I would have one final column for my discussion of why this works. Okay, so I gave you a couple of examples so that you can see what that looks like. So one of the examples that I found was an example of ethos. So remember that ethos is an appeal from character. And this is a rhetorical feature where the author is kind of demonstrating to us that he or she is an expert in the field or just generally a good person. And so we should believe them because of that, right? So I think that this is an example of ethos. So here's the quote that I've chosen. As to my own part, having turned my thoughts for many years upon this important subject and maturely weighed the several schemes of our projectors, I have always found them grossly mistaken. And then I included the MLA citation here so that when I need to put this into, a paragraph for an assignment or a paragraph for an essay, I'm ready to do that if I need to. So there's the quote, and then I have some discussion here about why it works. So this is effective because when he says he's been thinking about this for years and looking at everyone else's thoughts on the subject, it shows that he's done his research and taken his time. So we're likely to feel as though he's a trusted source on this subject. So in this passage, what Swift is doing is he's trying to give us this sort of sense that he has looked at this issue for years. And not only that, but he's maturely weighed. So he's really considered all of the other schemes. So all of the other sort of things that other people have suggested in terms of how do we solve this problem. So it seems like, based on what he's saying, that he's done a lot of research and really considered this deeply. And because of that, it's pretty effective at making it seem like he's an expert in the field, which is establishing his ethos. Okay? So that's just one example of, the notes that I would take when I'm identifying rhetoric. And this is something that I would like for you to do in your assignments that deal with rhetoric, but also when the time comes to write your rhetorical analysis essay, when you're choosing the source that you want to analyze, you should do something similar, where you've got the type of rhetoric, a quote that is an example of that type of rhetoric, and then your notes about why that is so effective. And this is going to help you be really prepared to write good paragraphs for assignments, for exams, and for your essay. So let's look at one more example of rhetoric. So again, I've got the same setup here, right? My type of rhetoric, the quote, and then my discussion of why it works. So this time I looked at satire. And the quote is this here. A young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled. And then I've got my citation. So, why does this work? When Swift finally reveals his proposal for how to deal with the overpopulation and famine in Ireland, he suggests we eat children, babies, in fact. This use of satire effectively shocks readers because up until now, he's gained our trust, and we assume he'll suggest a great plan to help these children. But instead, he argues we should eat them. He's not seriously suggesting this, but instead using satire to shock us into caring about these children and wanting to find a real solution to help them. So I chose this example here because this is when he drops the bomb on us, right? At this point, we've been reading for a while, and he's given us all of these, different hints about his proposal and makes it sound like it's going to be the greatest proposal. It's going to solve all of the problems. And then when we hear the proposal, it's this, right? That we should eat children. And so, of course, we're shocked, and he does that on purpose. This is satire, which kind of like sarcasm, which means that, he's not serious. But what he is serious about is that we should be shocked. We should be upset about this situation. And this is a really good way to get our attention, because when you mention, hey, we should eat babies, generally everyone's going to be outraged, right? So it's effective at getting us outraged and getting us upset so that we will want a real solution that could actually work. Okay, so a quick recap of rhetorical analysis. Remember to read actively and annotate. Identify the author's purpose. Identify the rhetorical situation. And remember, that's when some outside research is going to help you. So you'll look at what was going on at the place and time when this text was written. Identify the rhetoric that's used throughout the piece. And remember that active reading and annotation is going to help you with identifying the purpose and the rhetoric used. Then once you see what kinds of rhetoric are being used, you need to choose and discuss specific instances of the author using that rhetoric. And that's where you're using quotes to show that the author is using, pathos or ethos or satire. And then you'll also need to discuss why that rhetoric is effective. Don't forget to introduce your quotes with a signal phrase and cite an MLA. Okay, so that is our practice with rhetorical analysis, with satire, and with Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. If you have questions about rhetorical analysis, number one, remember to just keep practicing, because it's probably new and it's going to be a little bit difficult, and that's okay. But also reach out to the people in your group. Reach out to tutors. We have tutoring available online, and you get extra credit for our class when you go to tutoring. There's information about that in the syllabus. And you can also reach out to me. So remember that all of our lectures are recorded just like this one, and you can watch them whenever you'd like to. But you can also reach me for a meeting if you would like to, and we can do a chat on Zoom. If you have specific questions or you just feel like you need a little bit of extra help, I'm available for that as well. Okay. Happy rhetorical analysis